She was no older than 12. Her hands blistered. Her back stooped from hauling crates twice her weight. The factory floor smelled of oil and sweat, and the air was thick with the hum of broken machines patched with wire and hope. Every morning before the sun lit the edges of the town, she was there. They called her Mouse. Not because she was timid, though she was, but because she moved quietly, fast, unseen. No one remembered her real name. She had long since stopped offering it. If this story doesn't tug at your soul just a little, you might want to check if you still have one. Here on True Soul Stories, we don't do explosions or plot twists every 30 seconds. We do something much harder. We tell real, raw, human stories. The kind that sit with you long after the video ends. So if you're the kind of person who still believes in kindness, connection, and healing that doesn't come with a punchline, please consider subscribing. Now let's begin. The man who watched her from the corner didn't smile, didn't blink much either. He was tall, with shoulders slumped forward like they carried things too heavy for the day. His boots were scuffed, his coat faded, and his hat brim hung low. The others called him Grady Pike. 47, no wife, no kids, just a failing ranch out past Dust Hollow where even hawks had stopped circling. Grady hadn't come to town to look for trouble. He'd come to trade feed for flour and maybe fix a blade on his old plow. But when he saw her, Mouse, covered in soot, moving with a limp she tried to hide, something in his chest twisted. They were auctioning children behind the cannery, in a gravel lot too public to be ashamed. $10 a head, paid directly to the overseer. Cheap labor, they said, better than letting them starve. Grady had $10. Exactly. It was meant for the vet to check on his mare's infection, but his boots had stopped walking the moment they tied her wrists with baling twine and stood her in line. He didn't speak, just handed over the crumpled bills. No one asked questions. The man in the vest nodded, untied her, and said, "She's yours now." She didn't resist, didn't thank him either, just followed, silent and small, the way stray animals do when they're not sure if they're being fed or baited. They rode back to Dust Hollow under a swollen sky, clouds hanging like wet wool. She didn't speak the whole ride, didn't even flinch when the thunder cracked. The ranch wasn't much. A sagging barn, a house with more boards nailed over the windows and framing them, 3 chickens that refused to lay, and a windmill that only spun when no one needed it. Grady showed her the cot near the stove. He pointed at the tin sink, the outhouse, the crack pail by the well. She nodded, then curled up on the cot like a string pulled tight. After 30 seconds of this video, if your heart's already beating different, don't scroll. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story. There's more to it than you think. In the days that followed, she worked without being told, fed the chickens, patched the screen door, swept until her palms turned raw. She didn't ask for food, but ate what was given. Didn't ask questions, but listened to everything. Grady tried not to notice, but she folded his shirts and patched his socks with thread. She found in an old drawer. The first time he saw her asleep without shaking, it was because the wind had finally gone quiet. He learned her name from a scrap of paper she kept in a tin locket around her neck. Eliza, written in faded blue ink, barely legible. He didn't ask where her parents were. He'd buried too many of his own questions to dig up hers. One morning, a government man rode in, claimed he had deeds to prove Dust Hollow was up for resurvey, said Grady's land sat on mineral-rich soil, and a company back east wanted it. Grady laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the land hadn't given him anything but blisters and bones. Still, he said no. The man warned him, said others would come. Grady watched him ride off, and then started building a second fence line. Eliza brought him lemonade that day. She had squeezed it herself from the old bush near the creek. It was sour and warm, but it was the first thing he drank in months that didn't taste like regret. Weeks passed. Spring tried to rise. Wildflowers crept out from under the porch steps. Eliza sang once while sweeping. Grady stopped mid-step, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it meant she believed no one was listening. One evening, he found her in the barn, cradling the mare's head in her lap, whispering something soft. The infection was gone. Grady didn't ask how. He knew some things didn't need reason. But then came the twist. A bounty poster went up in town. A runaway, 12 years old. Last seen near Dust Hollow. Accused of starting the fire that burned the Hartman estate. Wanted for questioning. Dangerous. Grady stared at the sketch. It was her. The next night, he didn't sleep. Sat by the fire with the rifle across his knees. When Eliza came out, eyes wide, he expected her to run. But she didn't. She just stood there, waiting for him to say something. He didn't ask if it was true. He asked if she was afraid. She nodded. The days that followed blurred. Rumors swirled. Men came asking questions. Grady lied. Said she was a hired hand, a distant cousin, deaf-mute. Anything to keep them from looking close. But secrets rot in the open air. One morning, the barn door hung open. Hoof prints in the dirt. Grady's mare gone. Eliza gone. But the tin locket left behind, open, with a second note inside. He hurt my sister. I made it stop. Grady sat on the porch for hours, staring down the road. He didn't know if she'd gone to turn herself in or run farther. He only knew she hadn't asked for help. She'd saved herself once. She thought she had to do it again. That night, the fire would crackle like whispers. The stars blinked heavy above the ranch. And out in the distance, beyond the hills and the hurt, a shadow moved like someone trying to come home. The porch creaked beneath Jesse's boots as the last of the townsfolk trickled away. Their tools slung over shoulders, dust clinging to their pant legs. The sun had dipped low, casting long, gold-drenched shadows over the repaired fence and the blackened soil where ashes once whispered a ruin. The Boon ranch stood taller now, not in height, but in defiance. Lena sat cross-legged beside the hearth, the old carving knife resting across her lap like a sacred relic. Jesse watched her from the corner, coffee lukewarm in his calloused hands. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy, but not hopeless. It was a silence built from understanding. They had made it through the fire, through Caleb Dawes, through the ghosts. But peace, they would learn, doesn't last long out here. The morning that followed was colder than expected. Jesse rose before the rooster crowed, the air crisp, breath showing in puffs. He found Lena already up, pouring cornmeal into a pot with steady hands. Mara slept in the corner, wrapped in every blanket they owned. She'd been coughing more lately, a deep, wet sound that kept Jesse awake long after his shift on watch had ended. "Road's too quiet," Jesse said, mostly to himself. Lena didn't look up. She just nodded. By noon, he'd ridden to the edge of the property to check the trail. No tracks, no wagons, no sign of Caleb. But unease sat heavy in his chest. He'd lived too long in places where silence meant trouble coming. 3 days passed. Then came the letter. It arrived not by courier, but nailed to the same fence Caleb had burned. The handwriting was crude. Black ink, hastily scrawled. "Property stolen must be returned, or we take more. Tick-tock." No name, but none was needed. Jesse read it once, then burned it in the stove. He didn't tell Lena. Didn't have to. She knew. The way her shoulders tightened. The way she clutched her mother's hand longer before bed. She knew. And yet life went on, as it always does. Jesse taught Lena how to till the garden plot near the east wall. Mara spent her days making tinctures and teas, herbs laid out in rows like tiny soldiers. They even laughed sometimes, shared meals, played a broken fiddle Jesse found in the attic. But on the 7th night, the mule didn't return. They'd let him graze near the creek, tied loose to the willow tree. Jesse found the rope cut, blood on the bark, no sign of the body. Not wolves. A message. He came back with mud on his boots and a clenched jaw. Lena didn't ask what happened. She just went into the pantry and brought him the carving knife. Her hands didn't shake anymore. They waited. Each night stretched longer than the last. Until the 12th. It was past midnight when the first shot cracked the silence. Jesse woke, already reaching for the rifle. Mara screamed. The window shattered inward. Lena dragged her mother behind the table, just as the second shot splintered the wood. 3 figures circled the house, shadows flitting between cottonwoods. Jesse returned fire, each bullet measured, purposeful. One man went down. The others ducked behind the trough. "Back door," Jesse barked. "Now!" Lena hoisted Mara's arm around her shoulder. The woman was coughing blood now. The fire had taken more from her than they realized. They burst through the back just as another shot took off the corner of the porch. They ran, down the hill, past the burn barn, toward the old mining trail Jesse used to haul timber. Behind them, bootsteps, curses. The chase was on. At the edge of the woods, Jesse stopped. "Go. Don't look back." Lena shook her head. "Not without you." "I'll catch up." Mara moaned, too weak to argue. Lena hesitated, eyes shining in the moonlight. "Lena, please." She went. Jesse turned back, rifle raised, breath even. He dropped the second man with a clean shot through the chest. The third hesitated, then stepped forward. "Caleb." "No gun, just a knife and that same crooked grin." "You always knew it'd end like this," Caleb hissed. "Maybe," Jesse said, "but not tonight." They clashed like wolves. The knife bit into Jesse's side, but he didn't slow. He brought the stock of the rifle down on Caleb's wrist. Bones cracked. The knife fell. They grappled in the mud, fists flying, teeth bared. Jesse was stronger, but Caleb was desperate. It ended when Lena returned. She'd circled back alone, barefoot, breath ragged. She raised a carving knife and stabbed Caleb in the leg. Not deep, just enough. Enough for Jesse to take control. Caleb's face hit the dirt. Blood gushed from his nose. Jesse didn't kill him. He looked at Lena, breathing hard. "We don't become them." She nodded, pale and fierce. They left Caleb tied to a post just outside town, with a sign that read, "Next time, we won't be merciful." It was over. For now. The town didn't ask questions when Jesse and Lena brought Mara into the doctor's hut 2 days later. They knew. Everyone did. The kind of knowing you don't speak aloud. Mara didn't make it. She passed on a Thursday morning, Lena's hand in hers. Peaceful. Her last breath was a whisper Jesse didn't catch. But Lena nodded like she understood it all. The funeral was small. Just Jesse, Lena, and the wind. They buried her beside Jesse's wife. No marker, just a stone shaped like a heart by nature's hand. Lena stood still for a long time. "She's home now," she said finally. Jesse put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. They returned to the ranch. The house smelled of cedar and ash, of coffee and warmth. The garden bloomed despite the frost. The town slowly stopped whispering. Lena began teaching local children how to read. She baked bread for the schoolhouse, told stories by the fire. And Jesse? He kept building. Not just fences and coops. He built trust. A life. Something new. The land healed beneath their feet. One afternoon, months later, Jesse found Lena on the porch, staring at a bird building a nest beneath the eave. "Thinking?" he asked. She nodded. "About what comes next." He sat beside her. "You afraid?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." He smiled, then, "You know, when I first saw you behind that saloon, I didn't think we'd end up here. Neither did I. And now," she looked at him, steady, "now, I think maybe we were both saved." They sat in silence a while. Then Lena stood, went inside, and returned with the ledger. She opened it, wrote her name, Lena Boon. Below it, she added another, Jesse Boon. He stared at it. "Looks official now." She smiled. "I figured names should match, since you're my family." He tried to speak, but couldn't. Just pulled her into an embrace he didn't know he needed. That night, they lit a lantern and hung it by the gate. A signal, a promise, that anyone lost might find their way to safety. The ranch became a home not just for them, but for others, drifters, orphans, women with bruises and children with hollow eyes. The light stayed on. The fire inside never dimmed. And though ghosts still roamed the hills, they never dared step inside again, because this story wasn't about pain. It was about what you do after, how you rise from ash, hand in hand with someone who once asked you not to lock the door. How family isn't blood. It's a choice. It's a name written beside yours. And if you're lucky, like Jesse Boon was, the child you saved might just teach you how to live again.